Hey everyone, Roger here, one of the model makers for the Cape Blanco Heritage Society's Cape Blanco Lighthouse model circa 1910. I just wanted to talk for a little bit about some of the things that we did and learned along the way while we produced this model. First of all, this model was in no short order a research project. We did quite a bit of reading of documents and things that were provided to us by the Heritage Society as well as other organizations in order to acquire as much information as possible about how these structures appeared as they were in the early 1900s. And with regards to things like specific colors of the buildings or paints that were available that they might have used at that time. Those were interesting questions for us. We wanted accurate answers as close as possible. And so before we even began to draw some of the structures as they would be made as models, we did a considerable amount of reading just to try to learn as much as possible about those structures before moving forward. Just a few of the things that we reviewed I wanted to share with you. The Lighthouse Board annual reports concerning Cape Blanco from 1872 to 1917 was definitely one of the written resources that we pored over to gather as many physical details about how the structure of the lighthouse building and the other keepers' quarters, etc., would have appeared at that time. As you can see looking at these documents, there are passages here that reference certain features of the lighthouse and the associated buildings. So all of the written materials that we had were also accompanied by more graphic materials such as the actual lighthouse plans from before 1900. These were excellent documents that we had at our disposal from which to create the plans that we used to make the model as accurate as possible. So for instance, here's a case where we had a drawing of the lighthouse lens as it was prior to 1900, the first order lens, and we were able to sketch right on top of this image in a computer program to produce this model in very precise form in the scale in which we were working. So initially, of course, we wanted to do everything. We wanted to do all of the neat geographic features of Cape Blanco, similar to what we did about 6 to 8 years prior when we did the Port Orford Heads model. There were such interesting landforms there, and we wanted to capture that in this model as well. However, what we realized soon is that if we did try to do that and kept everything in scale, the lighthouse would only be a couple inches tall. And we really wanted to tell more of the story about the structures and life on the lighthouse grounds versus the geography of the area. So we proceeded to study how the buildings were laid out on the property and where that was located. And to do that, we looked at maps that we had available to us that were made later in time, like the 1950s, when the area was assessed carefully. And we imposed these maps on the top of Google Earth images so that we could decide upon the spacing, the distance between the lighthouse and the dwellings, and other features that were on the property at the time, such as the oil houses that provided fuel for lighting the lamp in the lighthouse. The first structure that I really wanted to tackle was this secondary keeper's quarters that was added later in time to the area. And I felt as though it was not the center of attraction here, so it would be a good place to start, and it would be a good model to try to go for initially, to just get my sort of jump in and get things flowing. So we had pretty decent plans for it, and I had architectural documents, and I jumped right in and started this model as I would any other by making the walls and the windows and the doors, the chimneys, and essentially just from scratch putting this together. We did a concrete foundation for it with the windows embedded in the real concrete. All of the windows were made with microscope cover slips for glass, and all of the windows in this structure were made from real wood. I used basswood to make these. I felt that that was a very realistic material for this structure, but making these windows by hand was a laborious process. Every window has about 20 pieces of wood in that window. So I learned pretty quickly, hey, if there's a better way to do this, I want to know about it. Right about this same time, they were making huge advantages in 3D printing, and for under $1,000, you could purchase and have at your home a 3D printer. And when I learned this, I just had to have one. I wanted to see if it could make the parts as good as I could. So the answer was unequivocally yes, definitely. These things can be made, and they can be made in very high detail. And it was a lot less work physically than it was to do them out of real wood. Where the rubber hits the road is learning to draw in 3 dimensions. And that was a huge step forward for me personally, from working for years in 2 dimensions, creating my own architectural drawings for my models, but now moving forward into a 3-dimensional on-the-screen model, which in turn would be printed by a 3D printer to make the scale part that I needed to complete the model. Several different pieces of software required to accomplish this, and a fairly steep learning curve. Totally worth it. So before I even had the first model completed, I moved right on to the original keeper's quarters, as I was just so excited to try some of the 3D printing techniques and parts to create this. And we had very good drawings of this first structure that was built. These drawings were provided to us by the Yakina Lighthouse group there, and their structure is very similar to the one that used to be at Cape Blanco. And so again, back to draft site to start out with the drawings and observing, examining the existing architectural plans from that time. I like to draw in this program initially in order to get an idea for how I'm going to draw the 3D parts. And then some of these parts will be made also from basswood, such as the wall material I think we used. Actually a thin plywood veneer covered with like a stucco type coating for the walls. And then these 3D printed windows though were just great because they were all identical and they fit the holes very nicely. Here's a little chimney that we worked out on a different kind of a 3D printer. Yeah, so this method by drawing on 2D and then moving to the 3D world ended up working out pretty well. And so then starting the construction of the walls and the windows, printing out, and the doors also then. The trick would be to coat these sufficiently such that they don't look like plastic. Also happening was I was beginning to think about the lighthouse itself, and with the 3D printer I wanted to move forward. My original thought was I wanted to have that lighthouse model appear as though it really was a masonry structure. So I built a mold. We 3D printed the inverse or opposite of the lighthouse shape, and I made this mold, and I was going to pour plaster and grout, a strong mixture, into this mold, and that would produce the ultimate lighthouse form, I felt. So it had an inner core that was steel, and it was supposedly going to slip out from inside this masonry lighthouse model, and therefore it would not be overly dense in the middle, and this was going to be the ultimate lighthouse, I felt at the time. Alrighty, so I don't seem to have a photo of how that turned out, but needless to say it was missing some major parts, and simultaneously someone become interested in what kind of progress we were making on the model. So I thought carefully about my resources and just so happened to have a veterinary surgeon on staff. So that worked out pretty well. And she was able to do a lot of really high quality work to complete the first model that we were working on and also contribute a significant amount of time and energy to finishing the lighthouse. So this turned out to be the way to do it, to print the lighthouse form in the polylactic acid plastic material that the printer could do, and then see if I could put a special finish on top of it that would make it look more like the masonry lighthouse I would really wanted to see. So also on staff, I just so happened to have a neighbor who has about 30 plus years of career experience drawing 3D objects on the computer. And so what a fabulous asset it was to have Patricia Flagg, and she did such a great job drawing all of these lighthouse parts. And what's really difficult about these are the windows, because they are concentric. In other words, they're not as wide in the inner portion of it as they are towards the perimeter of the structure. And not only that, but this whole thing is tapered and it gets complicated. I mean, it looks pretty simple in hindsight, but when you're moving forward and you have nothing to work with except some pretty ancient architectural documents that were good, there was no way I was going to accomplish this. And so it took the skills of somebody who really knew what they were doing to make this happen. So Patricia, I thank you. You were the source for the quality in this project, no question about it. Just look at the details she was able to accomplish with her software and her skills around the upper lip of that structure, all of which printed beautifully on a 3D printer, and I just took it from there with some of the old school model skills. So we printed the structure in 3 different printing sessions, each of which were about 8 hours. So to get the total height of the overall structure, we needed about a whole day, 24 hours, to create the complete model in the scale we were working. Once the 3D printed material was made, we glued those parts together and then coated the model with a thick layer of a masonry type material to give it that final finish that we wanted. So once we had finished up applying the surface and doing the texturing for the main lighthouse body, we were able to go forward and make the entrance for the lighthouse. And also simultaneously we were working on finishing up the 2 buildings that we had started. These photos show some texture applied in a brick-like pattern to the first original Keeper's Quarters building. No, I'm sorry, this is actually the lighthouse entrance that we're working on here. So this will be a brick texturing for that part of the lighthouse model. And then Hattie worked very diligently on completing the roofs, including the tiny gutter details and all of the cedar shake. Hattie worked very hard finishing up some of these projects with me, and she was basically just figuring things out. We were both working on hips, corners. She did a lot of the window detail after I 3D printed all the parts for the windows, including the sashes here. And every one of these sashes is actually layered with a microscope cover slip, which serves as the glass. And these are just some additional photos that show some of the details, like the pillars on the front porch. We made those steps in the porch. We poured out of the plaster grout combination mixture. Here you can see some of that getting fitted together. There's a little wooden windows and more close-up of the steps and those little fence posts, or porch posts I should say, the back steps and the windows in the back. So this is the second Keeper's building that came later in history. fitting the windows to the basement here in this photo. And there you can see some of the windows placed in the holes. And from above, that's the footprint. You can see the masonry wants to crack and crumble a little easy, and so coated it later. Here's how we made those windows on a strip, and then cut the material from the strip to make the individual casings. And there's the model sitting on the foundation for the first time, with some of the windows just kind of tucked in place. I'm getting ready to place that basement door, and also there'll be some steps that descend down to that basement door that we poured a mold for those. There's the mold for those steps. And so the way we do this is to take a photo of the building and then use a computer. Here's the microscope cover slips and the cutting tool for those, a glass cutter. And here's Hattie, and she's working carefully cutting those cover slips to turn them into window panes. And she might actually be placing some of these panes in the model as well, or making sure that the windows get cut to the exact right size anyhow. And there's our mold of those steps. Fitting windows more here. And again, the steps with the tops on them. So with the other structures coming along nicely and the lighthouse, we finally turned our attention to figuring out what we were going to do for the very uppermost aspect of the lighthouse structure, the cupola. And this would prove to be probably the most challenging part of the whole model to design and construct it and make it look as realistic as possible. We knew this would be the focal point, so we talked about several different ideas and finally decided that we would settle on a soldered brass frame with a microscope slide window glass. And then once we had those, it was a matter of arranging them such that there were the correct number of sides and that they were connected together appropriately. So we had to create some kind of a structure that would hold the material while it was soldered together. So what we did was we made and 3D printed something that we could pour a solid plaster object in that would be used to support the structures that we had made that we needed to connect. And being the resourceful model maker that I am, I hired this job out immediately to the most qualified individual.
It takes up quite a bit of soldering, so. No, those have all got to go back in there, which is why I didn't really want to take it off.
Right, wow.
But this is, you know, it is kind of flexible, so it can do this.
I see. Okay.
If there's glass in one of them still. Alright, so
Okay.
I'm going to take this away from here.
Yeah. From falling apart then.
Well, eventually it will get glued in there, but we don't want to do that yet because we need to paint the metal, right?
Uh-huh. So the plan then is you're going to scrape this down
Yeah, just a little bit.
to try to make it a little bit smaller?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Just all the way around. And this thing is flexible enough that I think it will be okay. It's pretty flat.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Mm-hmm.
Not 100% flat, but you can flatten it. It's pretty you know, it's going to be pretty flexible, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So. All right, I need to vacuum.
So eventually she did an awesome job and got all of those parts connected together around that plaster base, and also connected the thick bottom piece of brass to everything. And it was a bit of a task just learning how to make that connection in the soldering world. It's a lot of heat. I, in turn, was practicing on the computer with the drawing, and I think together we were able to figure out how to create the image and the drawing on the computer of the Lighthouse dome. This took a few trials to produce this, and then subsequently make the 3D print of this object. Well, we were making progress and things were coming along, but it was a challenging job. For sure, we had 3 models going on at the same time, many parts lying about in a cramped space, and we needed to finish some things up. So we were putting in considerable extra time outside of our day jobs to accomplish this work. And truth be told, it was time for a check-in. And so we knew we had a due date. This was before COVID, so we knew we needed these things done. So we put in the extra effort and tidied some things up and finished these primary models. So I mentioned at the beginning of the video here that we had some unique ways of creating objects for the model, and we were very happy to have the original documents for this lens. Again, this is a major focal point of the Lighthouse models, so we wanted to do our best work, and we were able to draw on top of the original plans in the program which we were using called Freecad. This is a free downloadable program that anyone can use with a PC to create three-dimensional objects and use a 3D printer to print them to scale. So here we're looking at the Lighthouse lens, which we wanted to be hollow so that we could insert an LED bulb. So we designed this hollowed out, and the only thing left to do was to find the machine that could print it, and they were available, so we bought one. With this machine, it's possible to print at a resolution that is tenfold greater than the first machine that we purchased, the filament printer. This machine works by virtue of using ultraviolet light to cure a UV sensitive resin in layers as thin as 0.02 millimeters. So once we had the lens printed out, then we were able to move forward with the construction of the rest of the Lighthouse parts, and pretty soon we moved on to creating the base of the diorama, which would have all the sidewalks and the oil shacks and essentially the geographic placement of these buildings in scale. We added static grass and used small figures to glean a better idea of how things would look. And meanwhile, behind the scenes, Jason Tilley working on the cabinetry for this model, a white oak table that would hold everything neatly together and make a very nice and cohesive presentation. Yeah, we should get this very same case.
How is the buttons? How can you push the buttons on it? Is it easy? Okay.
This is the weathering station here. We have the scenic foams and paints, powders, little tools. Working on a glass sheet. So at this point, we were pretty much going full speed, and it was a very exciting time, but it was also a little bit of a pressed time because we felt as though we needed to be timely in delivery of the model. As it turns out, we rendezvoused with Steve and decided that we could have the model available in April because the Lighthouse Visitor Center wouldn't be open until that time anyway. So we moved forward until probably February, I think it was, and created many scenic details for the model, including the fence, stacks of firewood, small flowers, some trees, and just everything that we could think of to add as much life to this as possible. So meanwhile, I was smitten with some of these images of the people who resided at the lighthouse a long time ago, and I was thinking about the new 3D printer we had that could do such fine detail. So I began to look on the internet to see if there was a way that we could make our own people. There were these two images, the original people and then those that reenacted that same photograph in the 60s. And so, yes, I felt this machine could possibly do it. And so we set about on a quest to create our own images reenacted of these characters and to come up with render 3D images on the computer and subsequent prints. So this was super challenging for the volunteers who sat for the photos. Each needed to sit for 20 to 40 minutes while I took about 200 pictures. We did this at the library. And unfortunately, not all sets of photographs produced a rendered three-dimensional image. So my apologies to those who tried so hard and participated, including Wiz, Susan, and Julian. And Hattie spent a ton of time on programs such as Blender and T2Box trying to get everyone ready for the 3D printing. Well, it took a little while and there was definitely a learning curve. Perhaps a little more time than we had originally planned went into the matter of creating all of these figures for the model, but we were rather pleased with the results. Well, eventually it was delivery day, and with the help of Mark Langton, Steve Roman, and Hattie Kugler, we were able to box everything up and take it on site. There's still quite a bit more work to be done. We needed to do the final fitting of all of these structures onto the model. That required some finagling and the application of a little bit more earth and scenic grass and additional details, but it's all here now.